All right, so where are we? We are covering the last module for this course. This is the last new stuff we'll have this semester, and it's historical linguistics, the study of how languages change and how they have changed over time. Now, just on a personal note, I mentioned in the tutorial last week that animal communication, that chapter in the textbook, was written by Mike Dobrovolsky. He was the person who taught me this class back in the some time ago when I took this in my first linguistics degree. And this final module is written by Robert Murray, who was also an instructor at the U of C linguistics department when I was there. And so I learned this specific material from him. So this is a nice, pleasant walk down memory lane for me. I recognize his teaching style in this textbook. Anyway, so also I realize as you follow along in the textbook this semester, I've seemed to jump around a lot, from this chapter and then skip ahead a few chapters and then back and forth and back and forth. One reason why I like to put this module in particular at the end is that for me it really ties back to the earliest linguists of the modern age, who were at the time called philologists. They were doing work that today would fall under the heading of historical linguistics. They were comparing languages, discovering parallels between languages, and beginning to construct family trees and reconstruct the earlier languages that hadn't been recorded. So I feel like this is a module that really ties up this sort of walk through a bunch of different areas of linguistics. Anyway, as usual in this video, I am going to recap last week's stuff, preview the material we're covering this week, and remind you of stuff that's coming up in the schedule. All right, so last week we covered non-human communication, and I'm also reminding everyone to pick the topic, the focus for your paper, and let me know about that. And I'll mention that again at the end of the video. So, all right, I've already mentioned the history of linguistics basis for this field, but there's also a connection to something that you may have learned right at the start of your linguistic studies. Remember, there's various properties that linguists associate with languages. They all have grammars. There are identifiable similarities across those grammars, the language universals. There's a sort of parity between all languages in terms of their communicative function. The grammars tend to be acquired subconsciously, so that linguists have to do a lot of work to piece together how languages work. And then the fifth property is known as mutability, the fact that all languages change over time. Right? You'll find this way back in chapter 1 of the textbook. There's many ways to establish this fact. I think the most enjoyable for me is the fact that people have been complaining about kids ruining the language through basically the entire recorded history of language. And I've linked a deeper dive on that claim in the video description in case you're interested. Anyway, so in this chapter we start with an example from Old English, which is basically a separate language from any form of English spoken today. But thanks to written records, we can trace the changes that have transformed Old English bit by bit into modern English. So after establishing the fact that languages change, we then get into some of the patterns that we can discover across those sorts of changes. And we see some of the broad ways that language change happens: articulatory simplification, the influence of spelling, morphological and syntactic reorganization, and even language contact. After that quick overview, we go section by section through some of the more specific details. So first we look at sound change. And remember that the vast majority of the world's languages are spoken, far more even than are signed, and only a portion of all of those are written. Right? So sound change is quite central to a lot of language change. There are a large number of sound changes involving either straight-up simplification of a single sound or change to a sequence of sounds, and it may feel like an overwhelming inventory of random things as you're going through this in the textbook, especially if you just focus on that list in table 8.3, just boom, 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 all a whole bunch of different names for types of change. But look through them, read through the sections following that. Each change is motivated by a fairly simple principle, basically one of two simple, two principles. It's either generally to do with making a sequence of sounds easier to produce or making sounds easier to perceive. And you may recognize some of the terms like assimilation, nasalization, umlaut, and so on. These are terms that we encounter in Linguistics 101 phonology. In the current context, they're changes over historical time rather than just properties of a language at one moment in time. After we go through all these different sound changes, we look at morphological changes. And this can involve the addition of affixes, often through grammaticalization of lexical forms, that is, full words, or through the loss of affixes. And we can also see broader systemic changes. Language is slowly transforming, say, from analytic to synthetic. We look in some detail at the influence of analogy and resynthesis on the morphological structure of a language. There's some great examples from the history of English to illustrate this. After morphology, we look at syntax, syntactic change. The most obvious thing here is changes in word order. So we get examples of English word order in Old and Middle English, showing these changes that lead towards eventually the SVO order that we have in modern English. And then after syntactic change, we get to the changing of words, creating new words, shifting the meaning of existing words. And there's many ways that a language can gain words. The most prominent in the known history of English are compounding and borrowing. And if you remember, or if you want to check back, just for beyond what we're interested in this week, Chapter 4 actually contains an extensive catalog of other ways that new words can arise in a language, things like onomatopoeia and blending and eponymy. As for the semantic shifts that occurred, there's a lot of ways meanings can change because there's so many different meanings and types of meanings. You know, if you have thousands of words in a language, that's essentially thousands of different meanings. But there's some common dimensions of change, you could say. Right? One of them is broadening and narrowing. Words taking either more general or more specific meanings over time. Another is amelioration and pejoration, which I don't think I've ever heard anyone else say out loud, so I may be pronouncing that idiosyncratically, but whatever. Think of pejoratives, pejoration. So this is where the connotation of a word can shift to a more positive or a more negative sense. And beyond this, we can talk about semantic shift as kind of a general term for words meaning something different to what they used to mean, right? Just sort of drifting in general. Okay, so now we've surveyed some of the ways that languages can change. Now the discussion shifts over to different ways that change can spread, both throughout the structure of a language and throughout the community of people using that language. So a change can either spread slowly through the applicable words, that's lexical diffusion, and we have the stress shift example in English, or it can apply in a sweeping rule-based manner across the whole language, and we have an example of the SH alternation in Spanish there. As for population, the ways that changes spread within and between communities are complex. Right? And as with most historical processes, it can be next to impossible to predict ahead of time what will happen. But in hindsight, you can pick out some really clear patterns, and the textbook identifies some interesting examples there. Okay, so far in this chapter, we've covered most of the ways that languages can and do change, but this is historical linguistics. We don't want to just know how things can change. We want to work out how things have changed. We want to trace the history of languages, find connections, reconstruct older versions of language. So how do we do that? Most of the rest of this chapter is a look into this question. It's the question of language reconstruction. And it'll focus primarily on reconstructing sounds because that's the most concrete aspect of this process. Although using the comparative method and the other methods we look at, we can reconstruct other aspects of language as well. Right, so the comparative method is putting related languages, or languages we think are related, side by side to look for and identify similarities and differences. this method can get us a lot of the way there. We can find out, we can group languages according to which ones seem to be more related and whatnot. So then, drawing on what we know about common changes, we can apply the phonetic plausibility strategy and majority rule strategy, and we can make hypotheses about the language that sits at the origin of the related languages, and figure out what the processes are that transformed that original language into the languages we see today. We get a really fascinating deep dive showing how this can work with some Romance words in the textbook. And actually, I want to take a moment here to clarify a naming convention in historical linguistics. It's there in the book, but some people still miss it. So let's nail this down. So when you have a group of languages that are related, that group is generally given a name. So, for example, in the textbook, we're looking at a group that includes Spanish, Sardinian, French, and some other languages as the Romance family. So the family is called Romance, and that's after Roman, the culture that spoke the language they all descended from. But when we use our methods that we're about to learn about to reconstruct the original language that eventually descended into all the different Romance languages, we use the proto prefix, as in proto-Romance. And this is the name of that hypothetical earlier language. I mean hypothetical in the sense of we're hypothesizing, we're reasoning to it rather than an evidenced language necessarily. Okay. So the family is called Romance. Romance refers to a group of languages that exist now, and the original language is Proto-Romance. That's a single language that we're pretty sure existed before, and we're trying to reconstruct it. And this is an important distinction. And the same convention can be applied, it can be used with any family. For example, we have the Indo-European Indo-European family, and linguists work to reconstruct the Proto-Indo-European language. We could do the same for Algonquin family, or Bantu, or Germanic, or Turkic, or any other language family. Okay, so that's my wave my hands and try to make that terminological subtlety clear. Anyway, after looking at the comparative method, we also get a short note on internal reconstruction, where sometimes we have a bit of evidence that's within a single language that tells us about its history and what the previous form might have been. So we don't have to line up a whole bunch of related languages side by side. And this can be helpful because sometimes that other method doesn't give us the whole picture. Some language families only have one surviving member, so very little reconstruction can happen without that kind of internal evidence. All right, so then we go deeper than the Romance family, and we look at some of that earlier philological work that I mentioned before, the discovery of relationships between what we now call the Indo-European languages, that Indo-European family, and then the ongoing work to reconstruct what the Proto-Indo-European language probably sounded like. So one key point in the closing of the chapter is the idea that as we try to reconstruct languages that were never recorded and are not spoken anymore, we need to keep in mind what linguists from all different areas, even outside of historical linguistics, know and are learning about plausibility, about what kind of patterns tend to exist, what kind of patterns are never found, and perhaps why they're never found, and so on. Okay, so there we have it, a whirlwind tour of the oldest subfield of linguistics. For this week, don't forget that quiz 4, covering writing and animal communication modules, that quiz is scheduled for Tuesday this week, March 30th. This is the last of the 4 regular quizzes, so make sure you have a good go at it. Open book as always, do your best. Okay. And this week is the last new module we're covering. At Thursday's tutorial this week, I will be prepared to discuss historical linguistics, of course, and also the final paper, which is due in about 2 weeks as part of the final exam. Okay? So the paper is not an in-class paper. I expect that you'll be working on it and writing it beforehand and just submitting it on that day. You do need to notify me of the topic that you want to write about for the final paper. So far, only about a third, maybe coming up to a half of the people in the class have been in touch about their topic. either on the discussion forum or directly over email. I haven't given you a deadline for notifying me, but I do need to approve your topic before you go ahead with the paper. So please pick something and let me know soon. And if you're stuck, you're having difficulty picking something, let me know. Send me an email, post something on the forum, come along to the tutorial, and I can help you out with that. But you need to pick something and start working on it now. Okay. After this week, we're not covering any new material, so you'll have some space to do that. All right. Okay, so that's it for this week's video. Remember to go through Chapter 8 of the textbook, available on eClass, to cover the stuff that I've mentioned in this video, to really learn the details that I was waving my hands and glossing over. Absolutely don't forget to do Quiz 4 on Tuesday, and come along to Thursday's tutorial if you can. And as always, let me know if you have any questions.